You tell your friend to leave him. You say it with total clarity, with that calm certainty that only comes when you can see someone else's situation from the outside. You say, "You deserve better than this." You already know what you need to do, and you mean every word of it. You can see the pattern so clearly, it almost hurts. The way she keeps going back, the way she makes excuses for things that don't deserve excuses, the way she shrinks herself down to fit inside a relationship that was never built for someone like her. You see all of it, and you know exactly what she should do. Then you drive home. You sit in your car for a second before going inside, and you walk into your own version of the exact same thing. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a job that's been slowly draining you for years. Maybe it's the way you talk to yourself when no one's listening, saying things you'd never let anyone say to someone you love. You know what you'd tell someone else in your position. You've probably said it out loud to a dozen people, and somehow, when it's your turn to take that advice, you just can't. Not won't. Can't. There's a difference, and it matters, because this isn't laziness. It's not hypocrisy. It's not some personal failing that you need to fix with more discipline or a better morning routine. What's actually happening when you give advice you can't follow is one of the most well-documented patterns in human psychology. And once you understand why it happens, you'll never judge yourself for it the same way again. But you'll also start to see that the gap between knowing and doing isn't as permanent as it feels. There's an old story about King Solomon, the biblical ruler who was supposedly the wisest man who ever lived. People traveled from distant kingdoms to ask for his counsel. He could untangle the most complicated disputes, see through deception, find the path through impossible situations. His wisdom was legendary, but his own life was a disaster. He accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines, many from nations his own laws warned against. He let those relationships pull him toward foreign gods and away from the principles he'd built his entire reputation on. He taxed his people into poverty to fund massive building projects. By the end of his life, the kingdom he'd spent decades advising others to protect was tearing itself apart. The wisest man alive couldn't follow his own wisdom, and researchers would eventually discover that this wasn't a contradiction at all. In 2014, a psychologist named Igor Grossman at the University of Waterloo decided to test whether Solomon's pattern was universal. He and his colleague, Ethan Cross, designed an elegant experiment. They brought in nearly 700 people who were in committed relationships and split them into two groups. One group was asked to imagine that their own partner had cheated on them, and then reason through what would happen next. The other group was asked to imagine that a close friend's partner had cheated, and reason through that instead. The difference was striking. The people thinking about their friend's situation showed significantly more wisdom across every measure the researchers tracked. They were more humble about what they didn't know. They were more open to compromise. They were more willing to consider that situations change over time and that the right answer now might not be the right answer later. In other words, they reasoned like wise, thoughtful, emotionally mature adults. The people thinking about their own situation, they got tunnel vision. They became more rigid, more certain, less willing to consider alternative perspectives. Same people, same intellectual ability, same life experience, The only thing that changed was whose problem they were looking at. Grossman called it Solomon's paradox. And the most important finding wasn't just that the gap existed, it was that it had nothing to do with age or experience. Adults in their 60s and 70s showed the exact same self-other asymmetry as people in their 20s. Growing older didn't close the gap. Getting more life experience didn't close the gap. The pattern persisted across every demographic they tested, which means this isn't something you grow out of. It's something built into how your mind processes information depending on how close you are to the problem. And that closeness changes everything. When you look at someone else's situation, you have natural psychological distance. You can see the whole picture because you're standing outside of it. You notice patterns they can't see because they're inside those patterns. You can weigh options calmly because the outcome doesn't threaten your identity or your sense of safety. Your rational brain gets to do what it does best, which is analyze, compare, and reason toward the clearest path forward. But when the problem is yours, that distance collapses. Suddenly, you're not analyzing a situation. You're living inside of it. Your emotions aren't data points anymore. They're weather. Your identity is at stake. Your fears are activated. Your history is in the room. And your brain shifts from wise advisor mode into survival mode, which operates by completely different rules. This isn't a flaw in the system. It's the system working exactly as designed. Your brain was never built to be objective about your own life. It was built to keep you alive. And keeping you alive means prioritizing emotional reactions over rational analysis when things feel personal and threatening. The wisdom is still inside you. It's the same wisdom you hand so freely to everyone else. You just can't access it when you need it most, because the part of your brain that could use it gets overridden by the part of your brain that thinks you're in danger. But here's where it gets more complicated, because the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it isn't just about emotional distance. There's something deeper happening, something that starts long before any specific problem shows up in your life. Back in 1957, a social psychologist named Leon Festinger introduced an idea that would reshape how we understand human behavior. He called it cognitive dissonance, and the concept is deceptively simple. When you hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time, or when your actions conflict with your values, you experience a kind of psychological discomfort. Your mind doesn't like the inconsistency, so it finds ways to resolve it. The fascinating part is how it resolves it. Festinger and his colleague Carl Smith ran a now famous experiment where they asked people to do an incredibly boring task, just turning pegs on a board for an hour. Afterward, they asked some participants to tell the next person that the task was actually fun and interesting. Some were paid $20 to lie. Others were paid just $1. You'd think the people paid more would be more enthusiastic liars. But the opposite happened. The people paid $20, told the lie, and moved on with their lives. They had a clear reason for lying, the money, so they felt no internal conflict. The people paid only $1. They actually started believing the task was enjoyable. They changed their own attitude to match the lie because they didn't have enough external justification to explain why they'd said it. This is what your brain does when your behavior contradicts what you know. It doesn't fix the behavior. It adjusts the story. When you tell your friend to leave a bad relationship but stay in your own, your mind doesn't sit with that contradiction comfortably. Instead, it generates reasons why your situation is different, why the advice that applies to them doesn't quite apply to you, why your circumstances are more complicated, more nuanced, more resistant to the simple solution you'd prescribe for anyone else. You've heard yourself do this. It's not that simple for me. They don't understand the full picture. I know I should, but that "but" is cognitive dissonance doing its job. It's protecting you from the discomfort of knowing exactly what you should do while watching yourself not do it. And it gets even more interesting when you look at what a psychologist named Daniel Batson discovered about moral behavior. In his studies, he gave people a chance to divide tasks between themselves and another person. One task was desirable, the other wasn't. He told them they could flip a coin to decide fairly, or just choose. Of the people who flipped the coin, 90% still gave themselves the better task, far more than the 50-50 split you'd expect from a fair coin toss. They used the appearance of fairness to cover a self-serving choice. But when Batson put a mirror in front of the participants so they could see themselves while making the decision, the bias disappeared. Self-awareness disrupted the pattern. When people couldn't hide from their own behavior, they actually became the fair person they already believed themselves to be. That detail matters because it means the gap between who you are when advising others and who you are when facing your own choices isn't a gap in your character. It's a gap in your awareness. The less you can see yourself clearly, the easier it is for your mind to construct a version of reality where the contradiction makes sense. You can actually watch this happening in real time if you pay attention. Think about the last time you gave someone advice about something you're personally struggling with. Notice what happened inside you while you were talking. There's often a flicker of something, a small internal flinch, a quick look away from the mirror that just appeared in front of you. Because while your mouth is saying, you need to stop accepting less than you deserve, some part of your brain is whispering, you know exactly who else needs to hear this. And then, what happens? You push that whisper aside. You focus on the other person. You pour your energy into helping them see what they can't see. And you do it genuinely, with real care, with real clarity. And when you leave the conversation, you might feel a weird mix of satisfaction and a hollowness. Satisfied because you helped someone. Hollow because you just articulated a truth you're not living. If that's familiar, you're not alone. And you're not a fraud for feeling it. The gap between what you know for others and what you can do for yourself isn't a character defect. It's a consistent, measurable feature of how human brains process information. And we're about to see just how wide that gap actually is. So far, we've been talking about what happens in the mind, the psychological distance that makes others' problems clearer, the mental gymnastics that let you live with contradictions between what you know and what you do. But there's an even more practical layer to this, and it shows up in the numbers. Researchers have been studying what they call the intention-behavior gap for decades, and the findings are consistently humbling. When you add up all the studies, intentions predict only about 20% of actual behavior. Think about that for a second. The thing you decide to do, the firm commitment you make to yourself, only translates into action about 1/5 of the time. For exercise specifically, the gap is even wider. Roughly half of people who firmly intend to work out regularly end up not following through. And it's not because they're lying to themselves about wanting to. They genuinely intend to do it. They believe they will. And then the moment arrives and something else happens instead. A researcher named Peter Gollwitzer spent years trying to understand why, and what he found reshaped the field. The problem isn't motivation. The problem is that we give ourselves advice in the wrong format. We tell ourselves what to do, but not when and how to do it. When Gollwitzer tested what he called implementation intentions, which are specific if-then plans like, when I finish lunch, I will walk for 15 minutes, the results were dramatic. In one study, 2/3 of participants who made these specific plans followed through, compared to only 1/4 who just had a general intention. The difference wasn't willpower, it was specificity. The plan essentially handed control of the behavior over to the environment, instead of relying on the conscious mind to remember and choose in the moment. This is why the advice you give your friend often sounds so much more actionable than the advice you give yourself. When you tell someone else what to do, you tend to be concrete. Call your landlord on Monday. Update your resume this weekend. Tell him how you feel before the end of the week. But when you talk to yourself, you stay vague. I should really get my life together. I need to start working out. I have to stop doing this. The vagueness is the problem. Your brain can't execute a vague intention any more than a GPS can navigate to somewhere nice. It needs coordinates. And when you're standing outside someone else's situation, you naturally provide coordinates because you can see the terrain clearly. When you're inside your own situation, everything is foggy, and the best you can manage is a general direction. But even specificity has its limits, because sometimes you know exactly what to do. You've even planned when and how to do it, and you still can't bring yourself to follow through. And this is where the story goes somewhere unexpected. You might recognize this pattern in the people closest to you. Think about the friend who gives the best relationship advice in your entire circle, but hasn't been in a healthy relationship in years. Or the one who can talk for hours about the importance of boundaries, and then drops everything the second someone asks for a favor, even when it costs them. Or the parent who lectures their kids about managing stress while running themselves into the ground 7 days a week. These aren't stupid people. They're not blind to the contradiction. In many cases, they're painfully aware of it, and that awareness only makes things worse, because now they're carrying the additional weight of knowing they're doing the exact thing they tell everyone else not to do. And sometimes the advice giving itself becomes the problem, because for some people, being the wise friend, the one who always knows what to say, the one everyone calls when things fall apart, that role becomes its own kind of hiding place. You pour yourself into other people's problems because those problems are solvable. Because helping others gives you a sense of competence and purpose that you can't seem to find in your own life. Every time you help someone see their way through a crisis, you get a small hit of confirmation that you're capable, that you're valuable, that you know things worth knowing. And that hit is addictive because It lets you avoid the terrifying question of why you can't seem to do the same thing for yourself. You might even notice that when your own life starts demanding attention, when your body is screaming at you to slow down, or your relationship is clearly in trouble, or your career has stalled for the third year in a row, that's when you suddenly become even more available for everyone else. You pick up the phone faster. You take on other people's problems with more intensity. You become indispensable at work or in your friend group, and everyone tells you how amazing you are, how wise, how generous, and none of them know that the helpfulness is a life raft you're clinging to, so you don't have to look at what's underneath. This isn't manipulation. It's survival. It's a way of staying connected to the version of yourself that works, the competent advisor, while avoiding the version that feels lost. And it can go on for years, sometimes decades, before the cost catches up. You might be that person yourself. And if you are, you already know how isolating it feels. Because from the outside, it looks like you just don't practice what you preach, like you're all talk. But from the inside, it feels more like there are two versions of you living in the same body. One who genuinely knows what's right and can articulate it beautifully, and one who, despite all that knowledge, keeps choosing something else. Not because they want to, but because something deeper than wanting is running the show. This shows up across every domain of life, and the patterns are remarkably consistent. In parenting, the gap is almost universal. A psychologist named Albert Bandura demonstrated something in the 1960s that every parent intuitively knows but rarely wants to face. In his famous experiments at Stanford, he showed that children learn primarily by watching what adults do, not by listening to what adults say. Children who watched an adult behave aggressively toward a toy went on to imitate that aggression, often inventing new aggressive behaviors the adult hadn't even demonstrated. The instruction didn't matter. The behavior did. What's even more striking is a follow-up finding. When children saw the aggressive adult get punished, they imitated less in the moment. But when researchers offered them a reward for showing what they'd learned, the children demonstrated every aggressive behavior perfectly. They had absorbed it completely. They just needed permission to express it. This is the uncomfortable truth about do as I say, not as I do. Children absorb both the instruction and the behavior, and when the two conflict, the behavior wins. Not sometimes. Reliably, your kids are watching how you handle stress, how you talk about your body, how you respond to conflict, how you treat yourself when you think no one is looking. And what you model will almost always overpower what you say. By the way, children are remarkably perceptive about this. Studies have found that kids as young as 3 and 4 already understand the gap between what people say and what people do. When given the chance to share stickers, young children predicted that they themselves would keep more than they'd give away, even while saying that sharing equally was the right thing to do. They already knew the advice was correct. They also already knew they probably wouldn't follow it. And research from 2025 found that children as young as 4 judge hypocrites, people who say one thing and do another, more harshly than people who simply behave badly without making moral claims at all. It's not the bad behavior that bothers them most. It's the contradiction, which means the discomfort you feel when you recognize this pattern in yourself that discomfort was installed early. You learned very young that the gap between knowing and doing carries social consequences, and the shame that comes with it isn't something you invented. It was taught to you, usually by people who were caught in the exact same gap. This is worth pausing on, because the intergenerational part of this pattern is easy to miss. Your parents gave you advice they couldn't follow. Their parents gave them advice they couldn't follow. And every generation watches the one before it, absorbs the contradiction, and feels the confusion of being told one thing while being shown another. The parent who lectures about the importance of self-respect while tolerating disrespect in their own marriage. The father who preaches ambition while living in quiet resignation. The mother who insists on honesty while keeping family secrets that everyone can feel but no one is allowed to name. These contradictions don't just teach the child that adults are hypocrites. They teach something more fundamental. They teach the child that knowing what's right and doing what's right are two different skills, and that possessing the first one doesn't automatically give you the second. That lesson gets absorbed into the bones, and it shows up decades later when you find yourself perfectly articulating the importance of boundaries to a friend while being unable to maintain your own. In romantic relationships, the pattern can be especially cruel. You might be the person all your friends come to for relationship advice. You can spot a toxic dynamic from across a room. You know the red flags, the attachment patterns, the communication breakdowns, all of it. You can explain with clinical precision exactly why your friend should stop texting their ex. And then your phone buzzes at 11 at night and you feel your chest constrict and your thumb hovering over a name you know you should have deleted months ago. The thing that makes romantic relationships so resistant to your own advice is that they activate attachment systems that were formed before you had language. John Bowlby, the psychologist who developed attachment theory, showed that the templates we build for how relationships work get established in the first years of life when your primary caregiver either showed up consistently or didn't. Those templates become what Bowlby called internal working models, and they operate like invisible blueprints that shape who you're attracted to, what feels like love, and how you behave when a relationship feels threatened. When you advise a friend about their relationship, your attachment system isn't engaged. You can think clearly because your survival doesn't feel at stake. But when it's your own relationship, your attachment system is running the show, and it's operating from a blueprint that was drawn before you could walk. The advice you'd give someone else is coming from your rational, adult mind. The behavior you can't seem to change is coming from a much younger part of you that still equates love with whatever it experienced first, even if what it experienced first was inconsistency or anxiety or having to earn every scrap of affection. And nowhere is the knowing-doing gap more visible or more painful than in the people whose entire job is to help others. The term wounded healer comes from Carl Jung, who borrowed it from the Greek myth of Chiron, a centaur who was struck by a poisoned arrow that gave him an incurable wound. Despite his own unending pain, Chiron became the greatest healer in Greek mythology, training heroes and teaching medicine. Jung used the story to describe something he saw in the helping professions: the observation that many healers are drawn to their work precisely because of their own unhealed wounds. The numbers bear this out in ways that are hard to ignore. Research has found that over 80% of psychology graduate students and faculty have experienced mental health conditions at some point in their lives. That's not a coincidence. The sensitivity that makes someone a gifted therapist, the ability to feel deeply, to read emotional nuance, to sit with pain without flinching, that same sensitivity often means they carry more pain of their own. They're not healing others in spite of their wounds. In many cases, they're healing others because of them. But here's the paradox. That same proximity to pain that makes them effective with clients can make them remarkably ineffective at helping themselves. Studies have found that roughly 4 in 10 mental health professionals experience burnout, with some surveys placing the number much higher, closer to 8 in 10. Therapists who spend their days teaching clients about emotional regulation, healthy boundaries, and self-care often go home utterly depleted, having given every ounce of that wisdom to someone else while keeping none for themselves. They sit across from people and hold space for pain with extraordinary skill. Then they close the office door and have no idea how to hold that same space for their own. The pattern extends to medicine too. Research using population-level data found that doctors and their families follow medical guidelines about half the time, which is no better than average patients. More than half of physicians in one study admitted to self-treating, and many acknowledged ignoring their own prescriptions. The people with the most medical knowledge on the planet are no better at applying it to themselves than the rest of us. And doctors have the highest suicide rate of any profession. Think about what that really means. Think about the cardiologist who can explain in exquisite detail the relationship between stress and heart disease, who has spent years helping patients restructure their lives to reduce stress, and who goes home to a lifestyle that would make any cardiologist wince. Or the psychiatrist who prescribes meditation and healthy sleep habits and therapy to every patient, and then stays up until 2 a.m. answering emails, eating badly, running on caffeine, and the fading belief that helping others is enough to sustain them. They're not unaware. That's the devastating part. They know. They know better than almost anyone. And the knowledge doesn't protect them. If anything, it adds another layer of suffering, because they can see themselves doing the thing they gently steer any patient away from, and they can't seem to stop. A researcher named Alison Barr found that nearly 3/4 of counselors and psychotherapists had experienced what she called wounding experiences that led them to their career. The very thing that broke them was the thing that drew them to fixing others. And the irony is that the closer you get to pain professionally, the better you become at treating it in others, and the harder it becomes to treat it in yourself. Because your own pain is too close. Your own pain is at zero distance. And at zero distance, all that training, all that knowledge, all that wisdom you share with clients every day, it can't reach you. That statistic is worth sitting with. Not because it's about doctors or therapists specifically, but because it reveals something about the nature of the knowing-doing gap that applies to everyone. The gap isn't a knowledge problem. It's not that these professionals don't understand mental health, physical health, or the consequences of neglecting both. They understand it better than almost anyone alive. The gap exists because knowing and doing are processed by entirely different systems, and the system responsible for doing doesn't care what the system responsible for knowing has to say. Which brings us to the layer underneath all of this, the one you can't think your way out of. There's a concept from the 1960s called psychological reactance, introduced by a psychologist named Jack Brame. The idea is straightforward. When someone tells you what to do, a part of you instinctively wants to do the opposite. Not because the advice is wrong, but because the demand itself threatens your sense of freedom. You can feel this happening when a parent says, "Clean your room," and suddenly, the last thing on earth you want to do is clean your room, even though you were maybe about to do it on your own. But here's what Brame realized. The threat to freedom doesn't have to come from outside. It can come from you. When you tell yourself, "I need to stop eating sugar," or "I have to start going to the gym," you're issuing a command to yourself that triggers the same rebellious response as an external demand. The thing you're telling yourself to do becomes psychologically linked to constraint, and the thing you're telling yourself not to do becomes more appealing precisely because it represents freedom. This is why strict diets backfire, why rigid self-improvement plans collapse, why telling yourself, "I absolutely cannot stay up late scrolling my phone again," almost guarantees you'll be doing exactly that at 2 a.m. The forbidden thing gains power from being forbidden. Your own advice becomes the authority figure your autonomic system rebels against. And it gets even stranger. A psychologist named Daniel Wegner demonstrated what he called the ironic process of mental control. He told participants not to think about a white bear. Not surprisingly, the thought of a white bear became almost impossible to suppress. The very act of trying not to think something requires your mind to continuously check whether you're thinking it, which keeps the thought permanently accessible. Tell yourself, "Don't think about food," and food is all you'll think about. Tell yourself, "Don't be anxious," and watch what happens. The advice you give yourself doesn't just fail to work. In some cases, it actively produces the opposite result. The harder you push, the harder something pushes back. And that something isn't laziness or lack of character. It's a fundamental feature of how human minds respond to perceived threats to autonomy, even when the threat is coming from inside. When you give advice to someone else, you're not threatening their autonomy. They can take it or leave it. There's no reactance. When you give the same advice to yourself, you're simultaneously the authority and the rebel usually wins. All of this would be frustrating enough if the resistance were purely psychological. But the truth is, much of it is happening in the body, below the level of conscious thought. When you give advice to someone else, you're using your prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain responsible for reasoning, planning, weighing options, considering consequences. It's calm, rational, and operates with the kind of clarity that makes good advice possible. And it has full access to everything you've learned, every insight, every framework, every lesson from your own mistakes. But when you're facing your own problems, especially the ones that touch on old wounds, the ones that feel threatening to your identity or your sense of safety, a different system takes over. Stephen Porges, the neuroscientist, who developed polyvagal theory, described the body's autonomic nervous system as having three modes. There's the ventral vagal state, where you feel safe and socially connected, and your rational brain is fully online. There's the sympathetic state, fight or flight, where your body mobilizes for action and your thinking narrows to survival. And there's the dorsal vagal state, a shutdown response, where you go numb, collapse inward, and disconnect. The critical mechanism that determines which state you're in is something Porges called neuroception. It's your nervous system's way of scanning the environment for safety or danger, and it happens completely below your conscious awareness. You don't choose to feel unsafe. Your body decides for you based on cues it's processing faster than your conscious mind can register. A tone of voice, a facial micro-expression, a feeling in your gut that something is wrong, even when everything looks fine on the surface. And here is the part that explains so much. When your nervous system shifts into a defensive state, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that holds all your good advice, gets taken offline. Not partially, significantly. The survival brain takes over because the survival brain doesn't have time for nuance or reflection or weighing the long-term consequences of different options. It needs to act now, and it defaults to whatever has kept you safe before. This is why you can know exactly what to do and still feel completely incapable of doing it. It's not a willpower failure. It's a nervous system override. The part of you that has the answer is literally inaccessible in the moments when you need it most. And you know what this feels like, even if you've never had the language for it. It's that moment in the argument with your partner where you can feel the wise response forming somewhere in the back of your mind, the measured, compassionate thing you'd tell a friend to say, and you watch it dissolve as something older and more reactive takes over. You hear yourself saying the sharp thing, the defensive thing, the thing that's going to make everything worse. And there's a part of you that's standing slightly off to the side, watching it happen, thinking, no, not this, don't say this. And it might as well be shouting through soundproof glass. Or it shows up differently. Maybe you don't explode outward. Maybe you collapse inward. You know you need to have the difficult conversation. You've even rehearsed it. And when the moment arrives, you feel a heaviness settle over your whole body. Your thoughts get foggy. You suddenly feel so tired you can barely keep your eyes open. And you tell yourself you'll do it tomorrow or next week or when the timing is better. The timing never gets better. The conversation never happens. And the thing you know you need to say stays lodged in your throat like something you couldn't quite swallow. That exhaustion isn't random. That foggy-headed heaviness is your dorsal vagal system activating. It's the oldest part of your autonomic nervous system, the part that predates fight or flight, the part that shuts you down when the situation feels too overwhelming to confront. It's the same system that causes a mouse to go limp in a cat's jaws. Not because the mouse has given up hope, but because its nervous system has calculated that stillness is the safest option available. Your body is making that calculation for you every time you freeze in front of the thing you know you should do. And it's making it based on data from a very long time ago. Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma researcher who wrote what became one of the best-selling psychology books in history, spent decades documenting how trauma reshapes the brain and body. His central argument is that traumatic experiences don't just create painful memories. They alter the way your entire nervous system processes the world. Your body develops a kind of muscle memory for danger, and that memory operates independently of your rational mind. You can sit in a therapy session and understand intellectually exactly why you react the way you do. You can articulate it brilliantly, and then you walk out the door and your body does the old thing anyway. Van der Kolk advocates for body-based treatments like EMDR, yoga, and neurofeedback precisely because the gap between knowing and doing isn't a gap in the mind. It's a gap between the mind and the body, and you can't close it by adding more knowledge to the mind. You have to reach the body where the old programming lives. You might recognize what this feels like from the inside, that moment when you know, really know, that you should speak up or walk away or say no, or finally take the step you've been avoiding. And instead of doing the thing you know is right, your chest gets tight, or your throat closes, or a wave of exhaustion hits you, or you just suddenly feel very, very tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind of tired that shows up specifically when you're about to do something your nervous system has categorized as dangerous. That's not weakness. That's your survival system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you from a threat that may not exist anymore, but that your body hasn't gotten the memo about. And this is where the pattern runs even deeper than the nervous system, because the question becomes, where did your body learn what's dangerous? What taught your survival system to treat certain actions, like setting a boundary, or accepting love, or putting yourself first, as threats? Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, had a framework for this that still holds up decades later. He called them conditions of worth. And the idea is painfully straightforward. When you were young, you learned that certain parts of you were acceptable and certain parts were not. Love and approval didn't come freely. They came with conditions. Be good, be quiet, be helpful, be strong. Don't be too much. Don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Over time, those conditions became the rules you live by. Not because they're true, but because they feel true. They were installed so early and reinforced so consistently that they became indistinguishable from your own beliefs. You internalize them as just who I am. And now, as an adult, when you try to give yourself the same generous, compassionate advice you'd give a friend, something in you resists. Not because the advice is wrong, but because following it would violate the conditions of worth you've been living by since before you could talk. Rogers talked about the gap between what he called the real self, who you actually are, and the ideal self, who you believe you should be. When the gap between the two grows too large, anxiety floods in, and the ideal self was almost never something you chose. It was assembled from every message you received about what made you worthy of love. So when you try to follow advice that would serve your real self, that would honor what you actually want and need, the ideal self throws up roadblocks. Not because it's malicious, because it's terrified, because deviating from those conditions has always, in its experience, meant losing love. You can feel this as a kind of inner tightening when you're about to do something healthy that also feels transgressive, like taking time off without guilt, or saying, "I'm not available for that right now." or spending money on something purely for your own enjoyment, without needing it to be practical or justified. These things are so easy to recommend to someone else. And when you try to do them yourself, something inside clenches. A voice, maybe not even a voice, more like a feeling that says, "Who do you think you are?" That feeling isn't coming from nowhere. It's the echo of a very old agreement you made with the world about the conditions under which you're allowed to exist. You learned that you had to be productive to earn rest, that you had to be struggling to deserve help, that you had to be modest about your needs and ambitious about your contributions. And those invisible agreements don't expire when you grow up and get a mortgage and start giving wise advice to everyone around you. They live in the body. They shape every choice you make. And they're the reason following your own advice can feel, physically and emotionally, like breaking a law. There's a therapist named Richard Schwartz who developed a model called internal family systems that maps this inner conflict in a way that makes the advice gap visible. Schwartz noticed that people don't have a single unified self. They have parts, different inner voices, each with its own agenda, each trying to help in its own way. Some parts are what Schwartz calls managers. They plan, they criticize, they keep everything under control. These are often the parts that give excellent advice. They can see clearly, they can analyze, they know the right answer. When you're advising a friend, your manager parts are running the show, and they're brilliant at it. But then there are the parts Schwartz calls exiles. These are the ones carrying the old pain, the old memories, the old beliefs about who you are and what you deserve. They're the wounded parts, and the manager's primary job is to keep them locked away so you never have to feel that pain again. And then there are the firefighters. These are the emergency responders. When the exiles threaten to surface, when following your own advice would mean confronting something painful, the firefighters rush in with distraction, numbing, binging, overworking, scrolling, anything to keep you from going where the advice would take you. This is why you can be so wise for everyone else and so stuck in your own life. When you advise a friend, their situation doesn't trigger your exiles. Your managers can operate freely, dispensing insight without any interference from the parts that carry your pain. But when you face your own version of the same problem, following through might mean touching something the managers have spent your entire life keeping buried. And the whole system mobilizes to prevent that from happening. It's not that you don't know what to do. It's that doing it activates a cascade of internal responses that feel genuinely threatening. The advice is right. Following it just happens to lead straight through territory your protective system has been guarding for decades. You can actually feel this happening if you slow down enough to notice. Imagine you've decided, really decided, that you're going to set a boundary with someone in your life. You've thought about it for weeks. You've written out what you want to say. You've told your therapist, your best friend, your journal. You know it's the right thing. The wise advisor part of you has never been more certain. And then the day comes. You're about to say the thing, and from somewhere deep inside, a voice says, "This is going to blow up." Another voice says, "They'll be so hurt. You can't do that to them." Another says, "Who are you to demand things from people?" And before you know it, you're scrolling through your phone or reorganizing your kitchen or offering to help the very person you were about to set a boundary with, because at least helping feels familiar. At least helping doesn't require you to sit with the sick feeling in your stomach that shows up every time you try to put yourself first. That wasn't one voice overriding another. That was a whole internal system, each part with its own logic, its own fears, its own best intentions, collectively steering you away from the thing your wisest self already knows is right. The manager who planned the boundary conversation has been overruled by the exile who remembers what happened the last time you asked for what you needed, and the firefighter who'd rather do literally anything than let you feel that pain again. Schwartz once described a client whose inner voice constantly told her she was hopeless. When the therapist asked that voice why it said those things, it explained that it told her she was hopeless so she wouldn't take risks and get hurt. The voice that sounded like the enemy was trying to be a protector. It had just never learned any other way to do its job. Gay Hendricks, a psychologist who spent years at Stanford and later coached corporate executives, described a related pattern he called the upper limit problem. His observation was that every person has an internal thermostat for how much happiness, success, and well-being they can tolerate. When you approach the upper limit of what feels acceptable, unconscious mechanisms kick in to bring you back down. You've probably experienced this yourself. Things start going well, maybe really well, and then you pick a fight with your partner, or you forget an important deadline, or you suddenly get sick, or you start that internal monologue about everything that could go wrong. It looks like self-sabotage from the outside, and in a sense, it is. But it's not sabotage driven by a desire to fail. It's sabotage driven by a nervous system that interprets exceeding its comfort zone as danger. Hendricks identified 4 hidden beliefs that set the upper limit. A feeling that you're fundamentally flawed, so good things shouldn't happen to you. A fear that success means abandoning or outshining people you love. A belief that you're already a burden, so having more would make it worse. And a sense that your accomplishments might threaten someone from your past. When you see someone else approaching their potential, none of your upper limit barriers activate. You can cheer them on without limit because their success doesn't trigger your programming. But when it's your turn, every step toward the life you'd prescribe for someone else can feel like a step toward something your body has been taught to avoid. So we have this picture now. Psychological distance explains why you can see others' problems more clearly. Cognitive dissonance explains how you rationalize the gap. The intention-behavior gap shows why even firm commitments dissolve. The nervous system explains why your body overrides your mind. Conditions of worth explain which specific actions feel threatening. Internal parts explain why knowledge and behavior are driven by different inner voices. And the upper limit explains why even approaching your own potential can trigger a retreat. The question then becomes whether any of this can change. And it can, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. The most promising research comes from something you already do naturally for other people. The very mechanism that makes you wise about their problems, psychological distance, can be turned inward. You already know how to create it. You just haven't been applying it to yourself. Ethan Kross, who runs the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory, at the University of Michigan, has spent years studying what happens when people refer to themselves in the third person. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" you ask, "What should your name do?" It sounds almost absurdly simple, but the neuroscience behind it is striking. In a series of studies with nearly 600 participants, Cross found that people who used their own name or the word "you" instead of "I" when thinking through problems showed less emotional reactivity and performed better under stress. Brain imaging confirmed what was happening. Third-person self-talk reduced activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with self-referential processing. It literally shifted the brain toward processing the problem as if it belonged to someone else. And the effect size wasn't small. The reduction in negative emotion was substantial, but the most remarkable part was that it happened without requiring any additional cognitive effort. People didn't have to try harder to regulate their emotions. The shift in language did it automatically. Simply changing "I" to your own name activated the same kind of psychological distance that makes you wise about other people's lives. Cross and Grossman took this a step further. They went back to the Solomon's paradox paradigm, the one that showed people reasoning more wisely about friends than about themselves. This time, they added a condition where participants were instructed to think about their own problems from a distanced perspective, as if they were a fly on the wall observing themselves. And the self-other wisdom gap disappeared completely. People reasoning about their own problems with psychological distance became just as wise as people reasoning about a friend's problems, which means the wisdom was always there. It never left. It was just blocked by proximity. There's a study with children that makes this even more vivid. Researchers gave 4- and 6-year-olds a boring, repetitive task and measured how long they could stick with it. One group was told to ask themselves, "Am I working hard?" Another group was told to ask, "Is their name working hard?" And a third group was told to pretend to be a hard-working character, like Batman or Dora the Explorer, and ask, "Is Batman working hard?" The children who pretended to be Batman persevered the longest. The ones who used their own name came next, and the ones who used first-person "I" gave up the fastest. Even at 4 years old, self-distancing improved follow-through. There's something both funny and profound about that. A 4-year-old who can't stick with a tedious task suddenly finds the persistence of a superhero, not because anything about the task changed, but because of how they were relating to themselves while doing it. The task was the same. The child was the same. The only difference was the distance between the self and the experience. And that distance, that tiny shift from "I" to Batman, was enough to unlock a capacity that was there all along. Adults aren't so different. You might feel silly about it, but the research is clear. When you're stuck in first-person overwhelm, drowning in the feelings and fears and "but what ifs" that make your own problems feel impossible, something as simple as stepping into the perspective of someone slightly outside your situation, even if that someone is a different version of you, changes the game. Not because it removes the difficulty, but because it gives your rational brain just enough breathing room to do what it already knows how to do. This isn't just a trick. It reveals something fundamental about how the brain works. When you say, "I should leave this job," you're activating the full weight of your identity, your fears, your protective parts, your conditions of worth, your entire emotional history with this situation. When you say, "Your name should leave this job," you create a tiny sliver of space between you and the problem. And in that space, the wise advisor that lives inside you, the one that comes out so effortlessly for everyone else, finally gets room to breathe. But self-distancing alone isn't enough for the deeper patterns, for the ones that live in the body, in the nervous system, in the exile parts that carry decades of old pain. This is where the work gets slower and requires something different than a cognitive shift. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion points toward what that something might be. Her central finding is that compassion for others and compassion for yourself are not the same skill. You can be endlessly generous and understanding toward the people around you while being relentlessly harsh with yourself. And the two tendencies can coexist without any sense of contradiction. You already know this from experience. The voice you use with a struggling friend and the voice you use with yourself at 3 a.m. are so different, they might as well belong to different people. What Neff's research shows is that learning to turn that compassion inward doesn't lead to the self-indulgence that people fear. It actually produces better outcomes. People who develop self-compassion are more motivated to improve, not less. They take more responsibility for their mistakes. They're more likely to engage in healthy behaviors. The thing that sounds like letting yourself off the hook actually puts you in a better position to do the hard things you've been avoiding. And there's a physiological reason for this. Self-criticism activates the body's threat system, the same system that shuts down your prefrontal cortex and puts you in survival mode. Self-compassion activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the calming system that keeps your rational brain online. When you beat yourself up for not following your own advice, you're literally pushing yourself further from the state of mind that would allow you to follow it. The harshness isn't helping. It's making the gap wider. This connects back to everything we've been talking about. Your nervous system needs to feel safe in order to let your rational mind do its work. Conditions of worth taught you that certain actions are dangerous. Your protective parts mobilize to prevent you from crossing those invisible lines. And the voice you use with yourself, the critical, disappointed, "Why can't you just do this?" voice, confirms to your nervous system that this is indeed a dangerous situation. Because that voice sounds exactly like the one that first installed those conditions. When you speak to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love, something shifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but the body starts to receive a different signal. The nervous system begins to register, tentatively, that maybe this isn't a crisis. Maybe following through on what you already know doesn't require perfection. Maybe you can take one step without having to take all of them at once. And you can pair this with the self-distancing you already know how to do. When you catch yourself spiraling in first person, "I'm so stupid for staying this long. I should know better by now. What's wrong with me?" Try switching to your own name. Try saying it the way you'd say it to someone you've known for 20 years and love deeply. Your name. You've been through a lot. You're allowed to take your time with this. You don't have to figure it all out today. That isn't positive affirmation. It isn't pretending the problem doesn't exist. It's giving yourself the same honest, grounded compassion you'd give anyone else. And research confirms that it changes what's happening in your brain and body when you do it. There's another layer to this that matters, and it has to do with how change actually works at the nervous system level. Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, talks about a concept called titration. The idea is that you don't heal by flooding yourself with the thing that overwhelms you. You heal by touching it lightly and then pulling back. A little bit at a time. A little bit, then rest. A little bit, then integrate. Like building tolerance to cold water by wading in ankle deep before trying to swim. This applies directly to following your own advice. You don't have to leave the relationship today. You don't have to overhaul your entire life this week. You don't have to become the person you advise others to be in one dramatic leap. You just have to take one step that the person you advise others to be would take. Set one boundary. Have one honest conversation. Make one choice that your wise self would endorse, however small. And then notice that you survived it. Notice that the thing your nervous system was terrified of didn't destroy you. That noticing is the corrective emotional experience. Your body learning through direct experience that the old rules don't apply anymore, that the conditions of worth can be violated without catastrophe, that you can follow your own advice and still be loved. This is what therapists mean when they talk about corrective emotional experiences, not a lightning bolt of insight that changes everything. A new experience that gently, repeatedly contradicts the old learning. Your body learned that following your own wisdom is dangerous. It learned this through hundreds of small moments over many years, and it will unlearn it the same way. Not through one revelation, but through repeated experiences of doing the scary thing and surviving, of listening to the part of you that knows what's true and not being destroyed by it. The hard part is that this process doesn't follow a straight line. You won't wake up one day and suddenly be able to take your own advice without friction. Some days the gap will close, and you'll do the brave thing and wonder why you ever waited so long. Other days, the gap will yawn wide open, and you'll find yourself right back where you started, giving beautiful advice to everyone around you while your own life stays exactly the same. And on those days, the temptation will be to use that gap as evidence that something is wrong with you, that you're broken in a way other people aren't, that you're uniquely incapable of doing what you know is right. But you now know that's not true. You know that every human brain processes its own problems differently from other people's problems, and that this isn't a bug. It's a feature that kept your ancestors alive. You know that the knowing-doing gap exists in everyone, even the therapists and doctors and experts who understand it better than anyone. You know that your nervous system can override your best intentions, not because you're weak, but because your body is trying to protect you from something it hasn't yet learned is safe. You know that the parts of you that resist change aren't enemies. They're protectors who took on their roles before you were old enough to choose. And you know that the conditions of worth you've been living by weren't conditions you set. The wisdom you give away so freely was never missing from your own life. It's been there the whole time. The voice that speaks so clearly to your friends, the one that cuts through their confusion and sees straight to what matters, that voice is yours. It has always been yours. The work isn't to become wiser. You're already wise enough. The work is to close the distance between the person who knows and the person who does. And that distance is not as fixed as it feels. Your brain can learn to create space where there was none. Your nervous system can be taught new definitions of safety. Your parts can learn to trust that following through won't destroy you. These things don't happen through willpower or discipline or another list of things you should be doing differently. They happen through patience and repetition, and the kind of gentleness you've always found so easy to offer everyone except yourself. So the next time you catch yourself giving advice you can't follow, try something. Instead of the shame spiral, instead of why can't I just do this, try talking to yourself the way you'd talk to the friend sitting across from you. Use your own name. Say it the way you'd say it to them. And notice what happens in your body when you stop being the person who should know better and start being the person who deserves the same compassion you've been giving away. You might find that the advice doesn't change at all. You already knew the answer. You just needed to hear it from someone who wasn't so close to the problem. And that someone has been you the whole time, not the you who's tangled up in the fear and the conditioning and the old survival patterns. The other one, the one who shows up effortlessly when your friend is hurting, the one who sees clearly, speaks kindly, and knows exactly what matters. That version of you isn't reserved for other people's problems. It lives in you. It has always lived in you. The distance between who you are for others and who you are for yourself can shrink. Not because you force it with willpower or shame yourself into changing, but because you learn slowly and imperfectly to treat your own life with the same generous attention you've been giving away. To sit with yourself the way you sit with a friend. To look at your own situation with the compassion and clarity that comes so easily when the stakes aren't yours. Your nervous system might not believe that's safe yet. Your protective parts might still insist that following your own wisdom will lead to something terrible. The conditions of worth that were installed before you could choose might still be humming in the background, telling you that people like you don't get to have what you prescribe for everyone else. But those aren't facts. They're old recordings, and recordings can be replaced by new experiences, one small brave act at a time. Maybe today, the one thing you do differently is notice the gap without judging it. Maybe you catch yourself mid-advice, mid-sentence, and just pause for a second to acknowledge that the words coming out of your mouth are meant for you too. Maybe you say your own name quietly and give yourself the same permission you'd give anyone else. That's enough. That's the beginning of something. Not a fix, not a cure, just a crack in the wall between who you are for everyone else and who you're learning to be for yourself.